Jenna, we are so grateful to know you and be lucky enough to read your incredible writing. Thank you for your friendship. I will not say, do not weep, for not all tears are an evil. Tolkien.
Welcome to the Tea Grannies. I'm Elise.
And I'm Maria. Today we're going to dive into the sci-fi genre with author S.J. Pratt. So pour yourself a cup of tea and let's get started.
So we're going to talk about the definition of sci-fi. And you already know this, Maria, but for everyone else, as with every genre we've researched for this podcast, or so it seems, everyone seems to disagree all over the place about what the genre actually is, what science fiction actually is. So, like, I feel like every time I look up a Wikipedia page for a genre, it's like, well, definitions on this term do vary from person to person, but it's like, okay, stop it. just don't even do the intro anymore. Just lay out the different perspectives for me. But anyway, for our purposes, we're going to try and keep things a little bit simple because this is not a genre that we are experts in, but we both do enjoy it on occasion. We're going to go with the basic premise that it's a genre of speculative fiction that deals with science and or technology in some key way. And you can decide for yourself what key means for you.
Many options.
And whether that's space exploration, time travel, parallel universes, extraterrestrial life, all of those, something else entirely. There's so many options. Like we've said about the other genres, there's so many subgenres. Like you can basically do whatever you want, which is why fiction is such a delight. Similar to fantasy, in a lot of discussions, science fiction will often be further categorized into like hard science fiction and soft science fiction, depending on the writer, depending on how they approach it. But in some conversations, I found this really interesting. Some people have pointed out that those classifications don't actually look at how rigorous the science is. They look at the type of science. Like if it's physics, then it's hard science. But if it's zoology, then it's soft science. And it's like, what? Zoology is just as much of a science as physics. Like, get over yourselves. But people have different ideas of what science fiction is. Some people are more snobby than others, as we've discovered with ourselves and fantasy and wine.
It's so true.
So you've got everything from Frankenstein to Star Wars in this genre. So if you want to narrow it down, we're going to have to start looking into subgenres again, which is yay fun. There's no spaceships in Frankenstein, unless I'm rudely misremembering this book and English class and the 3 or 4 times that I've read it, because it's one of my favorites. It's also like gothic fiction, which is, that's the part that I like. I love gothic fiction. That's why I like Frankenstein, but it is sci-fi. And it still falls into the same umbrella category as Star Wars, Star Trek, Red Rising, Skyward, Dune, The Martian, Artemis.
Ice Planet Barbarians. I'm sorry, I had to say it.
This is why I love you.
I hijacked that. Yeah, if you need a super basic breakdown of what the sci-fi genre is, you don't need to look any further than Star Wars. You got spaceships hopping from planet to planet, lots of frickin' laser beams, and points if you know what movie that was from. You get it. So I used to be pretty intimidated by this genre, even though I grew up like obsessed with Star Wars.
Me too.
Obsessed. Like watched the entire trilogy every single weekend, kind of obsessed. So it's only been in the last few years I've started reading it as a genre, and like it's awesome. So yeah, and yes to everything Elise said. I'm not super useful today.
You're gonna be great. Similar to you, I remember watching the original 3 and then the prequel episodes. Watched those all like over the course of a couple weeks with my older brother right before the new ones started coming out, because we were like, we gotta just refresh the memory, you know. It's not like we know these backwards and forwards already. So yeah, I feel that. But also didn't start reading much sci-fi until quite recently. Like that's been a gradual recent development for me. But yeah, now that we've gone into definition, we're going to switch gears a little bit, hop into our first page critique, which we're always very excited about. And while this is not a sci-fi page as far as we know, We can't really know based on a single page, but as far as we know, it's not. This episode is about a character named Sarah, just like our author guest, who we'll be interviewing later in this episode. We're very excited for this. And I feel like I need to give that fiction disclaimer here because of this. This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, events, etc. are the products of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, such as our guest, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental, yada, yada, yada. And oddly fitting, but I can pretty much guarantee you that S.J. Pratt didn't live in 1884, our guest for today, unless she's about to, like, blow our minds with time travel research, which would be, like, the perfect sci-fi genre primer. Yeah.
It would.
We're ready. Just blow our minds a little bit. Okay, but first page is first. We're going to launch into the reading and then give our feedback after. The Lost Legacy of Sarah Winchester. Mrs. Sarah Pardee Winchester has returned from Europe and can be reached at the home of her mother-in-law Jane Winchester at their Prospect Hill address. Courier and Journal, New Haven, Connecticut. 1984. Autumn. Sarah had not planned to return to New Haven so soon, perhaps not at all. The earthy, moldy chemical smell of death had seemed to follow her here, after her beloved husband William's death. In Europe, in the museums and churches, in the libraries and countryside, she'd found the fresh air she needed to heal and the possibilities of a new, meaningful life, until another death called her home. Her oldest sister's illness had ripped Sarah back to reality, and back home to nurse Mary through the painful process of dying. Cancer, just another form of wasting illness that forced those around you to watch you slowly die. She'd had enough of that. Avoiding the breakfast room full of sunshine and light-hearted chatter, she strode through the familiar halls of the house she and William had shared with his parents, the Italianate house they had designed and built together after the death of their baby daughter. In Sarah's absence, William's sister Jenny and her family had moved in. It was as if new actors now filled the roles intended for her and William. She felt like an intruder in her own home. She could not blame Mother Jane for seeking company. The house was overlarge, and its empty halls would have reminded her of all she'd lost: a husband, her only son. She and Mother Jane shared the propensity to lose those closest to them. Since coming home to Connecticut, grief threatened to burst out of her, like a sigh she'd held onto for years. Bracing herself, she approached the closed door to William's former study. Instead of knocking, she reached out and stroked the mahogany door, still polished smooth. It transported her, back in time. She and William had spent weeks selecting just the right design for this door, the size, the weight, the shape of the panels. Like all the details they'd selected for this Prospect Hill house, this door was perfect. She closed her eyes and could almost feel William's touch on her face. He seemed so close she could smell him, sweet tobacco and gun oil. The door lurched open. Memory disappeared in a puff of smoke. T.G., Jenny's husband, glared down at her in the door's place. Sarah. What a surprise.
So overall, I'm very interested in the time period and the potential family dramatics in this piece. But in general, I don't know exactly where this story is going. We see Sarah grieving her husband and living back in their old house. But what's driving the plot now? Is Mary dead? Is she still alive at this time? Is she living in the house with them? Is her brother-in-law an overbearing pain in the ass? Is there the risk of her being kicked out of her own home because, sexism? So there's a good amount of sympathy for our main character right off the bat, which I really do like and appreciate. Yeah. But I need to see more plot once we're past that early point. Again, first page problems. We don't have a back cover copy, so we don't know where this is going. But I think a more punchy first page will go a long way to drawing readers in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm also curious about the time period, like you said. The family dynamics at play will always be of interest to me. And I think our very brief glimpse of the brother-in-law character is a sure catalyst for conflict, unless I'm misreading I read a lot of derision and sarcasm into his dialogue there right at the end, right? So I'd be willing to keep reading just to see what he's about to say, because to me he seemed angry with Sarah, and given that she's a grieving widow caring for a dying sister, apparently she and William lost a baby, that just seems very harsh for this woman.
Tragedy.
She's gone through a lot, and this guy coming in and just being an ass about it is, ripe with conflict. So we like that. Sympathy is established early on. We like that. There's some gorgeous lines in here that really anchor the reader in with Sarah's emotions, like feeling like an intruder in her own home. I really latched onto that one. I really liked how that was placed. And I also love some of the phrasing used to describe like the depths of her grief. And I'm already hoping that she gets some kind of happy ending after all of this, because wow, that's a lot. And like the reminiscing moment where she's remembering William as she's touching the door of his office and thinking about that is like, as I was reading it, I like the emotion hit me a little bit, and it was like, oh wow, this is really,
that was actually my
vivid.
favorite part of the whole piece. I thought that was so beautiful.
Yeah, it's beautiful, vivid, and just kind of raw in the emotionality of it. And then I think similar to you, there were two main things that I struggled with as I read this piece, and I think the main one is, or the first one is, the number of people introduced in such a short amount of time. There are a lot of names and family relationships at play, and it made it a bit of a challenge for me to follow the timeline, the events, and the memories, while also trying to keep track of like, okay, who's Mary again, and who is Jenny and Jenny's husband, and how do they relate to Sarah? I can't remember. So I struggle with that, and I think trimming back on some of that could be helpful just for flow and pacing, and just introduce them more slowly as time goes on. And then the second thing was a sense of direction. Like Mariah has already mentioned, that we don't get much of a description of where Sarah is until she approaches the study door. And leading up to that, we're kind of floundering a bit through her memories, which, like, she is floundering as well. So I understand why that was the chosen approach. But it's difficult for a reader to follow that and to really be grabbed and drawn into a story with that as a starting place. It's also unclear whether Mary, her sick sister, is still alive or not. So the reader doesn't have a sense of what Sarah's doing now versus like what she was doing before. Is she still caring for her sister, or has she already passed away? And then we learn a lot about Sarah's late husband and the life they had before the story even started. So we learn all of that, but we learn very little about Sarah's life now, why it matters now, why the reader should be interested in what she's doing right now. And now, like Maria said, if we had the back cover copy to read, that might provide more context. We might have more direction. It might flow a little bit better. But I still think the starting point could be presented more clearly in this first page to ground the reader, like with description in the current setting, in the house, the time and place the story will actually happen in, and Sarah's current emotional state as opposed to bouncing back and forth between how she was in Europe and now she came back. And that's just almost too big of a time span to open the story with. We need something a little more granular, a little more focused in, to spread Sarah's memories apart more and bring the reader along.
Yeah,
does that make sense?
Like something a little bit more immersive at the beginning. Like as you were talking about it, I was thinking, I love that scene with the study so much. Like you could almost start with the first paragraph or a little bit of the first paragraph where she first talks about returning home and that her husband is dead. And then in the next bit, she goes to the study door, and then the brother-in-law comes out and she goes, oh, I can understand why like Mother Jane wanted to have company, and it like leads in kind of more naturally into everything.
I like that.
Yeah, I feel like that would probably work because, I mean, maybe it's me. I love a good emotional hook, like in the first couple paragraphs where I'm like, oh, tragic.
Tragic, yeah.
I'm sold. So, and that's my favorite part of the first page. So I wonder if we could or the writer could move it up a little bit, and then it would just hit a little earlier and we'd still be just as invested, I think. And then like you said, it would lead more gently into all the other introductions.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think that is exactly what is missing from this, is just that if you move that hook up, and then you still establish the sympathy, the grief. Like she's going through loss. She lost her husband. We're aware of that. She's in conflict with her brother-in-law right away as a grieving widow. That's not a fun dynamic. So you would establish empathy and conflict right in the first like paragraph or two, which is exactly what I think both of us are looking for.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Workshopping on the fly. Yeah, we got there eventually in the end. I think this is the power of our together brain. This is a disclaimer. Unfortunately, we had some technical difficulties with the recording of this episode, and some of our audio was no longer accessible after we did the recording. So due to scheduling conflicts and things, we weren't able to re-record it, and just ended up taking what we had and Frankensteining it together. So I guess that's kind of fitting for the topic of this episode. But because of that, you may notice that some of the conversation pieces don't always line up the way that you expect them to, or it sounds a bit patchy. That is why we are so grateful that you've tuned in, that you've been listening to us, or maybe you've just started listening to us. Thanks for being here. We appreciate your support, and thanks for bearing with us through the ups and downs of the podcasting life. So just like we found with fantasy, again, science fiction has a massive list of subgenres, and we're only, even with our two brains together, our shared brain cell, we are only like marginally familiar with some of them. Mm-hmm. So you've got like your standard apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic fiction, like The Hunger Games and Divergent. Those would be considered sci-fi. And then another one that's actually pretty big that I only discovered, I want to say a couple of years ago, is cyberpunk, which is, it's a pretty large subgenre, and one of the most well-known titles I can think of is probably the Bladerunner, but I've only watched the movies, so I don't actually know if the book falls under cyberpunk. Maybe not.
I didn't even know it was a book.
Yeah, right.
I don't even know if I've seen the movie.
I wrote a short story, a cyberpunk short story a little while back. Do you remember that?
I remember that.
One?
It was so good.
It was super fun. And it ended up being, very cyberpunk, kind of by accident. Or it was for an anthology. I didn't end up getting in, but I was shortlisted for it. And I think it was like supposed to be a cyberpunk anthology. So that was super fun. We've also touched on gothic science fiction a little bit with Frankenstein, which is, again, a personal favorite of mine. Steampunk is another subgenre I've always been really fascinated by. Just with all of like the gears and machinery and working that into a kind of an almost fantasy setting in some ways. It really depends on the author, how they choose to integrate it, but really cool. There's a video game coming out about Pinocchio that is a steampunk version, and it's just wild, like super interesting. So I've always been really interested in that. But another one kind of related that I've learned about more recently is solar punk. And people may or may not be familiar with the term. I would say the one recommendation that I can think of for this subgenre is Becky Chambers' work with A Psalm for the Wild-Built, the Monk and Robot series, which cozy. It's like cozy science fiction. If you want to compare it to cozy fantasy, it's cozy science fiction. And basically, solar punk is like an optimist's response to the post-apocalyptic work that's been so popular in the genre for the last couple decades. And honestly, I could use more solar punk in my life. A little more positivity, a little more hope. As I understand it, it's all about humans developing strategies and technology to respond to these major disasters that the climate crisis has caused, issues like climate change, so that humanity can survive instead of being doomed to mass destruction and all of those fiery deaths and things that come with the rising global temperatures, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. And us living in BC, we are pretty used to the crazy fires.
Oh, yeah,
which
we're
is
feeling that
super
right
sad.
now.
Yes. But anyways, back to sci-fi. There's some debate about fantasy science fiction. So I read Gideon the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir, which was like so much fun, especially the audiobook. The narrator was amazing. So I would say it falls into that category. Okay. There's also like space western, which would be like The Mandalorian, which is set in the Star Wars universe. If you haven't watched The Mandalorian, Elise,
you're just calling me out right there. Jeez.
It is so good. I love it so much.
I've heard only good things, and I mean Pedro Pascal. What do you want me to say?
What else do you need?
Yeah, exactly. I will one day get around to it, probably sometime. But TV and I just don't generally happen. But I was just about to say, if you want another space western, Cowboys and Aliens with Harrison Ford is of course that's a real thing. Oh my God.
I loved that movie. I remember when it came out, people were like really judging it. I'm like, that looks fun. And then I went and saw it in the theaters, and I was like, it was fun.
It was fun.
I enjoyed it.
I will accept this. I can respect that. But last but not least, I guess, in our little trail run of science fiction subgenres, I'm going to mention feminist science fiction, because that is like a distinct subgenre of the science fiction genre. You could probably create that for fantasy, but I haven't seen it referenced anywhere in the same way. I think for obvious reasons this happens in science fiction because it's so male dominated.
Yes.
Because men are considered to be the people that know about science. So we'll just, blow up that bullshit. It runs deep. Yes. I think that's why I never got into science fiction as a kid. But we're working on that slowly but surely. And I know nothing about this subgenre, okay? I'm going to be straight up about that. I have never thought about it up until recently, and so I'm not bringing it up because I know what I'm talking about, but because this brings us very nicely to our introduction for our lovely guest today, S.J. Pratt.
Yeah, sounds great. Well, thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm so excited. Like Elise said, I'm S.J. Pratt. I write young adult science fiction and fantasy. The first book of my trilogy came out last year, the 716, and in that we get to dive into a futuristic version of our world where gender norms are reversed. And we follow Andy, who's a scrawny, ambitious guy, and he wants to be an engineer. And his dream seems really impossible because only women are allowed to go to university, until he meets Olivia, who's beautiful, rich. She's going to become the next leader of the nation, probably. And Andy gets this chance to prove himself on the female stage in a way that no man has got to before. So we kind of cue like some social rebellion, questioning of norms. Yeah, a bit of found family. There's some romance in there, and there's actually an adorable robot that likes tea. So I feel like that's very relevant.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. Okay, confession, I haven't read it yet because I've been in a book slump for like a month. It's at the top of my stack. I meant to read it before today, but I'm editing and I just can't seem to do both. Like I can edit or I can read.
Yeah,
not at the same time.
Totally.
But tea robot, I am sold.
Yes.
I'm so excited now. Okay. Well, thank you and welcome. So we have a few questions for you today. So we'll start gently and we'll go with what's your background with sci-fi and how did you get into writing it?
Well, I grew up on Star Trek. My parents have been huge Trekkies. I'd say like, I don't know, every weeknight that we weren't doing sports or something, like we were watching some sort of, Next Generation or Deep Space Nine or whatever. So I've just always loved that. And I think in general, I've just been really fascinated with that key sci-fi question of like, what if? So, like what if aliens came to Earth, or what if we created sentient robots that were faster and stronger than us? And, or like in the case of my own work, what if pink was considered a really awesome color and femininity was heralded and it was like, well, of course it's all women in the boardroom, like what would that look like? And I think, that's that sort of beauty of sci-fi is that like it's an invitation to explore those ideas and have some really interesting discussion.
Okay, I love that. I also love the gender swap because it like just makes the sexism in the world so black and white when you do that. Like, and people are so bewildered by it. Like, well, that's what it's like.
Yeah. And it's like, I've had a lot of comments that are like, it feels so weird when you read about, there's a scene where Andy gets told he should smile more, like he'd look more handsome if he smiled more. And, and he shouldn't like show off his legs and stuff. But he's in his work uniform. So he's like, well, why did my job make a uniform with shorts if I'm not supposed to, whatever. But like, it's really interesting people's response because they're like, it's so weird when you see it happen to a man, even though it's kind of the same thing that happens all the time to us, us women. So it's pretty fascinating and fun.
I do have a book, but I haven't read it yet. It's called The Power, and I forget the author.
Yes,
but
I've got it too. Okay. I haven't read it either.
Hey, we could do a buddy.
But it's in my bookshelf. Yeah.
Yeah, it's in my bookshelf too. And it's similar. It has that premise. And that was actually specifically why I bought it, because I was like, I have never seen this before. And I'm into it.
Our next question for you is getting a little bit more kind of general writing practice. And we'd like to know what you think writers struggle with the most when it comes to writing stories in the sci-fi genre.
I would say in general, probably the world building. Like, I think when you're writing a story that's set in the real world, set in now, you know, there's kind of a lot of that world building is somewhat provided for you in terms of like, what technology do we have? What's the government like in that place? You know, even like weather patterns. Whereas when you are writing sci-fi, there's sort of you get to ask all of those questions, or you have to ask all of those questions. You know, what are the plants like in this world that you've created? How does the government work? You know, what kind of technology exists? And then importantly, you know, how many people have access to that technology? Is it just the upper class? Is it everyone? Like, there's, you know, and then I think the trickiest part is thinking through the implications of those world building choices that you've made. So for example, in my book, you know, deciding that I wanted to create a world where men were the subservient sex. I guess I knew that that wouldn't simply be a flip of what our world looks like. We wouldn't sort of have just a patriarchy, but with women on top. So it's sort of like, so how would that world look if we really valued femininity? Like, would a caring, loving leader be way more celebrated than someone with a really mighty fist? Maybe we would value teamwork more than individual achievement. Like, what, you know, so you sort of had to think through all of these, and then how do those implications work for your character as well? How do they respond to that world that they live in? And so yeah, that world building part can be really tricky, but also really fun.
Okay, that's what intimidates me about writing sci-fi, because I've gotten into reading it in the last like year or two, and I want to draft something with sci-fi, but that's where I'm really intimidated, is all the tech and then how people interact with it. And like you said, like different classes of people. Like when you watch Star Wars, you're like, well, they just hop on a ship and go, but like not everybody has a ship. Like how many of them are like just stuck on the planet, like just stuck there forever? And like I saw there was an episode of The Mandalorian where he has to take like public transit, and it's so funny. He's like checking in his weapons with like a robot, and then he has to get on and sit with all the passengers and like his armor and stuff. And it was so like,
it's so good,
hilarious. Yeah. And it was kind of funny because I was like, well, that's how everyone else goes. Not everybody has their own ship, right? So there's so much that goes into it. Like the social classes must have a big impact on the world building, is where I was going with that.
Yeah.
Which leads us to our next question. Look at this. We set them up so great. So what authors do you think do a particularly good job with sci-fi, and which ones would you recommend for people to read, just for fun or for research?
Yeah, it's a good question. I always recommend I, Robot by Isaac Asimov. It's, you know, one of the classics, and I think if you're wanting to get into writing sci-fi, reading those classics is quite good. Like, it's a good foundation for you to find out where the genre kind of came from, and like, you know, and then you can explore how it came from, like how it went from there. But yeah, as for I, Robot, I think it's one of the classics. It's got both that sort of technology aspect, but also the social aspect that I really enjoy about sci-fi. It kind of goes into, you know, there's these 3 laws for how the robots operate, and so it's looking at like, you know, would they lie to you to protect you? Because one of their rules is that they have to protect you at all costs. So what is that like? What's the social implications of that? So it's quite, you know, interesting. And then it's also a series of almost like related short stories. So I think it's quite accessible because you could just kind of pick it up and go, right, I'm just going to read this one, and then I'll go back to my fantasy writing or whatever. Like, you don't have to commit to something like June, which I think is also a really good recommendation, but is a much more like, that's a hefty book. So if you're looking for like an epic, you know, like, you know, awesome world building, great environmental stuff, June by Frank Herbert is really good. And then I think if you're kind of looking for something a bit easier, I think YA is quite good. Like, it's quite accessible. And so I'd probably recommend Illuminae by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff. That's quite fun. That's more of a space setting one. And then if you wanted more of the sort of gender equality stuff that I'm quite into, there's a great book called We Set the Dark on Fire by Taylor K. Major. And yeah, that's quite an interesting sort of like bit of social rebellion, feminist kind of stuff.
Okay, awesome. Okay, I have a massive list of recommendations, so I'm hijacking this.
Yeah, go.
So,
I'd love to hear.
I think my top recommendation that I also think is very accessible is the Murderbot Diaries by Martha Wells. I know, I love those. And on audio, like that narrator just does the best job. I think that's the best audiobook I've ever listened to. I want them to do like a animated series of Murderbot, and I want him to voice it. I think that would be perfect, right? But anyway, I could go on about Murderbot forever. But they are novellas, so they're easy to get into. There's one full-length novel so far, but the novellas are easy to get into. And then, of course, my baby, the Red Rising trilogy by Pierce Brown. I think that's like the #1 recommended one. But it's like Game of Thrones meets Hunger Games in space. And even I was surprised by how brutal it was, even though I was warned. So I would say definitely read that. It's awesome. I haven't read the second trilogy yet because like I'm still sad about the first trilogy. I'm not ready. If you want something less murdery, A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers is awesome. She writes really good, like cozy sci-fi. And this one follows like a ship's crew while they tunnel wormholes into space, which is like really cool. And like somebody has to make the travel accessible for all these ships, right? I just think it was neat. And I'm not embarrassed to say this, where you brought it up on the show. Ice Planet Barbarians. I'm not afraid to recommend this one because
I've never heard of it. I'm gonna have to look it up now.
Might scar you for life. Okay, it's like smutty sci-fi romance, and it's like this group of women were abducted from Earth, and they like crash land on like, they call it not Hoth in the books. It's like Hoth but not Hoth, and they end up being like rescued and like everything with these like big blue alien guys. And I downloaded it like sort of as a joke because everyone's talking about it on Bookstagram, and I'm like, I need to see what this is all about. And then when I came up for air, I had read 8 of them.
Yeah.
Like,
it's addictive.
They're addictive. They have surprisingly good world building. Like they're romance first, sci-fi second. But I was really like, these are actually much better than I thought.
Pretty good. Yeah.
Recommend them. Quick
Love
reads. And then for less smutty sci-fi romance, I liked Hunt the Stars and Eclipse the Moon by Jessie Mihalik. And those are more like plot driven. And I have the third one on my shelf, but I haven't read it yet. And those are all my recommendations.
So we're obviously big believers in reading what you write. And I think, I mean, Mariah and I have talked about this on the show before, but like, unless you do that, you're not going to know your genre well enough. You're not going to know your readers well enough to give them what they're looking for. So that's always going to be our biggest first piece of advice that we give, of like where to start with writing anything. But getting into more specifics, I guess, where would you recommend newbie sci-fi writers begin when it comes to the technology in their story?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think obviously with these stories, everything's so related, but I personally would start with thinking about your world and your story and your characters, and sort of like what technology that story and those characters require. So like, for example, do your characters need to travel incredibly far distances? Well, then maybe you need something, some sort of faster than light travel, or some sort of interplanetary teleportation, or, so think about what the story, like rather than just sitting down and coming up with a million ideas, thinking about what the story and what the characters actually need. So like, yeah, for example, in my book, I knew that I wanted the sort of government and other organizations to be able to instantly tell what gender you'd been assigned at birth. And that would allow different access to, like, there's like women's only libraries and that kind of stuff. So I created a piece of technology that is sort of embedded just above the eyebrow. And it's got like a infallible blue or pink light, depending on which gender you've been assigned. And then from there, I kind of had the brainstorming session of like, what else could be in there? Like maybe your credit card information is in there. You now don't need a wallet, like, you know, your ID and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, so you can have some sort of fun with it, thinking about what your characters need, what your world needs, and then how can you build from there, I think.
Okay, you kind of answered it, but like, what are your first steps when you start building a setting for sci-fi?
Yeah, so the setting, like, I mean, I love that world building part. I think it's really fun. I think I would start with, like, what's the bigger picture? Is this set on Earth? Is it set in space? Is this a new planet but there's no space travel? Like, what is the really big picture of the setting? And then from there, sort of drilling down into, you know, okay, yes, we're going to stay on Earth and it's dystopian, so you know, there's no need for spaceships or whatever. But I think, yeah, so I guess with society, like what I did with this one was kind of looking at our own society, and because I think it's easier to start with something and draw inspiration, because coming up with a whole way of people like interacting and social class and all that kind of stuff, like actually just starting with a blank page is really hard. So, you know, sometimes thinking about your own society or a society that you know really well, and then thinking, okay, but I want to make it so that there's, you know, I don't know, no social class, or I want to make it so that, you know, the people who live in the mountains are the top class or whatever. And you can kind of start to think about how you would change what you understand quite fundamentally about your own society.
A lot of people want to start small because they'll be like, it's easier if I just start with something small and then I build from there. But I think when you're drafting, especially, and coming up with new ideas and new settings and stuff, you got to start way bigger picture than that, because I made that mistake on one of my recent drafts. And then when I went back to edit, I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know where to start with the big picture, because I've spent so much time figuring out the little crap. Sorry, my dogs are snoring so loud, and we might not be able to get that off the audio. So sorry, listeners. If you hear any snoring, that is Maggie having a nap.
Kind of on that same note, what are your top 3 recommendations for anchoring the reader in that setting that you take those first steps creating it, and then you really want the reader to immerse themselves in it, to really feel like they're there? How would you approach that?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say make the setting part of the story. So have your main character experience the world with your reader. You know, make that setting relevant to the story, to the character's experience, and you know, maybe tell us how your main character reacts to that setting, reacts to their world. Are they annoyed by the injustice around them, or are they excited that they get this opportunity to do this test or visit this place? And so how do they respond to that world? And you know, I think people like characters that interact with the setting, rather than just a huge info dump of like, and then we have these, you know, places. It's like, why is the character there? What, you know, and then how do they react to it? And because you do all this world building research and you're like, oh my god, I've come up with the most amazing world, I'm going to put it all in, you know, and it can get a bit, you know, much for the reader. So if it's relevant to the character and the story, then I think that's the perfect place to really, you know, go into your setting. And then what else? I would say, it sounds kind of strange, but details can make a new setting feel really real. Like, for example, instead of saying that they, you know, saw this derelict neighborhood with lots of abandoned houses, like tell us about the main character walking past and that they noticed the like peeling wallpaper and broken frames, and maybe the table is still set for dinner and there's like rodents eating, you know, this carcass that was hastily abandoned. And, you know, some of that kind of stuff can tell us so much about the, you know, did these people, like in that instance, it sounds like the people left in quite a hurry, you know, and so you can tell us that without having to specifically say, and, you know, 1 year ago or 3 weeks ago, people left. You know, you can get that across, and like, and even just a few of those details helps the reader paint their own picture of what this abandoned house might look like. So, yeah, I think that's
That might actually be the main thing that I notice when I'm reading other people's writing, like whether I'm workshopping or like reading a book, the info dumps. Like, I mean, everyone's really rant about info dumps by now. I really don't like them because they pull me out of the story. I feel like I'm reading a textbook, and then that just doesn't work for me. I feel disconnected. And so, like you said, like having the character interact with the setting and then bring in the information that way, like that is so much more natural. Like if you think about when you go sightseeing, like how many of us walk into like the Tower of London and we're like, okay, so the Tower of London was built in blah blah. Like we're walking through, we're like, whoa, this is super old, and like look at these super short steps, and you like bonk your head on a thing, and then you're learning about it as you go, and it's just so much more natural for us as people because that's how we experience the world. But it's crazy, like it's the same thing. Everyone's like, I made this world, I gotta tell them all about it.
Yeah, and I get it. You're so excited and you've spent so much energy brainstorming and thinking, but like, it's like, what does the reader actually need to know at this moment?
Yeah, I think that's it. And my next question will be, what are some of your favorite resources or strategies for researching all the science elements in your fiction? Because the average sci-fi writer is not a scientist themselves.
Yes, I know, right? And it feels like a hurdle. I would say my biggest thing is just talking to people and like people who know their stuff. So for example, I'm not an engineer, but I wanted my two main characters to be engineers and to work on this plane together. And sort of I guess Andy's more of a mechanic because he's not allowed to be an engineer, but so I needed to understand sort of the engineer's point of view. Like I wanted to talk to engineers about what are their pain points, like everything down to like women's mechanic overalls often don't fit, like, or they don't have women's ones, they only have the generic ones, and so you end up with a size that's like too big because you've got to fit your breast into this like actually a pole shaped thing. And or if you're really tall, there are some people who would complain that they were tall, and so these are sort of made for, I don't know, a regular sized person, and so your feet would like stick out the bottom. So just understanding little pain points that helps with those details that we were talking about before. But then also obviously I wanted to make sure all my engineering processes were correct. I wanted a mechanic or an engineer to be able to pick up this book and go, yep, that is how they would make a plane, or whatever it is, or that would be something that went wrong when they did that thing. But then also not have it totally bogged down in that as well. Like I wanted people to be able to not know anything about engineering and still enjoy the book. So like the romance is kind of weaved in there and everything too. So yeah, I think, sorry, a bit of a rant, but talking to people and like it can be kind of scary, but I have never had anyone say no. Like I just reach out to people. I've got quite a presence on Instagram, so I just reach out to people and say, hey, I'm struggling with how this like flow thing works, and I just want to make sure that this, can I have a quick chat to you? I think it's hard to put yourself out there, but honestly, those people know so much and they're so passionate about the idea that you want to get this right in a book. Because I think my husband's an engineer and he often reads books and he's like, no, it's ridiculous. Like they can't do that. That defies the laws of physics. And, and so he gets like, frustrated by it. So I think when you do put that effort in to get it right and talking to them, valuing their opinion, I think people are really happy to help. So
it's true, because like with horses, for me, when I read books, like especially in fantasy, and I'm like, hey, horses are not cars. Why do you think horses are cars? And you clearly didn't run this by anybody. You could have just DM'd me and been like, hey, is this how a horse would react? And I'd be like, God, no.
Yeah, exactly. And
that's the kind of stuff, the people that do know their stuff get totally pulled out of the book because of it.
Exactly.
And
exactly. Yeah. And I think that can be a bit of a hurdle to writing science fiction, but I don't think it has to be. And then the other way would probably be to read, like we were talking about before. I think you can find out a lot about how people would talk about a hovercraft moving, or teleporters or whatever. You can find a lot of that sort of like more of the fiction side of things. You can find that sort of stuff out by reading other people's work or watching sci-fi TV shows or something like that. And also I don't know. I mean, I suppose it depends how deep you want to go, but like some academic journals are really useful of like just reading the abstract of like, because, you know, if you read the whole thing, you're going to, you know, it might get a bit overwhelming, but they usually have to like summarize their sort of findings or their ideas or whatever. And you could even just read the conclusion, like, yes, faster than light travel is not possible, or it is possible, whatever. And you can take that you know, as inspiration, or at least a foundation, a science foundation for your ideas. So and a lot of them, I don't know what it's like where you guys are, but here you can get a lot of them through the libraries. So you don't, you know, you can get.
Yeah, I think you can do that here too.
Yeah. So,
and a lot of scientists say, like, if you want to read their paper and you're supposed to pay for like a subscription or something, they say to reach out to them privately and they will send it to you. I've heard that quite a few times.
That's what I mean. Like, people are really happy to help. So
yeah, it's true. I think it's easy to be pessimistic and be like, no one will help me. No one would want to help.
Yeah.
But, you know, like if someone messaged me and asked for help with like something horse related, dog related, I'd be like on that right away. Like standing in my kitchen typing out like 3 paragraphs because I like to help people, especially with their writing. So I think it's important to reach out. Like the worst thing people can say is no. So
exactly. And then you're right back to where you were before. Like you still you know the same amount about hovercraft, whatever. And so you lost nothing, you know, it's
How familiar are you with science fantasy? Like, is that a genre or subgenre you spend much time with at all?
I love fantasy and I love science fiction, but I must have read like a ton of ones that fit into science fantasy, but I don't know much about it. I think I do love the idea though. I think it's quite a cool, because I think science fiction and fantasy, like there's a lot of you know, similar sort of tropes and approaches and that kind of stuff. So you know, I think if you're into one, like that's a natural, you know, place to start looking at, you know, to read if you wanted to expand your reading.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why I ask is like I'm curious, I guess maybe not from experience, but how you might think about the approaching the balancing act of science versus fantasy in your plot points. Because if you think about something like To Sleep in a Sea of Stars by Christopher Paolini, where he takes science pretty seriously in his approach to sci-fi, and he uses like different fictional technologies to explain how people do space travel over long distances, and just like freezing the body in a state that the person can survive without really being aware of time passing for years and years and then arriving at another point in space. Like he uses that. But other books like Hunt the Stars that Maria talked about earlier, in that series they use wormholes, which is just a way to jump through space really quickly and not having to have that time element. And yeah, I'm curious how you would think about approaching that, or if you've ever thought about it at all.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a real balancing act, isn't it? So maybe it is, again, comes down to your plot and your characters and your world and what they need. And you know, is taking 20 years to get somewhere, is that adding anything to the plot, or is that just, you know, slowing it down? What do you know, so maybe you can approach it again with that sort of story focus.
I think plus with sci-fi, I mean, there is some unbelievable elements because like the technology you're using has not been created yet. So you can say like, like we can travel to space super fast, hyperspace, totally a thing. And you don't even like, you can make it such a norm in the world that you don't have to explain why it worked.
Yeah.
Like
exactly.
We never learned in Star Wars why hyperspace works.
Why?
They just do it. Right?
And I think there's a lot of those sorts of like, you know, tropes and ideas that science fiction readers inherently understand. Like you say, they get in a spaceship and they go to the next planet, and people like just get that. You don't have to explain exactly how all of that works. So maybe there's something there too about your reader expectations and what they might understand. If you're coming up with a totally new technology, maybe you need to explain it a little bit better than if you're just doing, you know, a wormhole, which has been done plenty of times before.
That's so true. Like a traditional piece of the world building. And actually, since we've recorded our first blurb on this episode about fantasy sci-fi as a subgenre, I got my Fairy Loot book for the month, which is called Immortal Longings by Chloe Gong. And it says right on there that it's a sci-fi fantasy.
Ooh.
So I think we can answer our own question and that it is considered a genre now. Maybe some diehards probably don't agree, but I think we can call it. And I think it might depend, like I haven't read it obviously because it came like an hour ago, but it could be like very sci-fi with fantasy elements. It could be super like fantasy with some, like we've read fantasy with tech, right? So it's like a little bit.
Yeah,
so I think
there's a lot of
depend. And that's kind of fun too. Like I mean, as an exercise, I'm like, what would these characters do in this fantasy world if they had cell phones? Like, it would change everything. So there's a little bit of fun with that. I had this debate the other night with my husband where I was like, if we time traveled or fell through a portal and we didn't have our cell phones anymore, how lost would we be to start? And then how bad would our withdrawal symptoms be not having a phone? There's no Wi-Fi there. There's no internet. And now I'm like, that's the stuff of nightmares. Like if that happened to me, I'd be like, I didn't think I was addicted to my phone, but I'd be like jonesing for bookstagram. I'd be like, oh gosh, I don't know what to read next. Anyway, onward. So you've recently started working on another project outside of the sci-fi genre, a fantasy project. So how does writing fantasy compare with your experience writing sci-fi so far?
I love it. I think there's a lot of the same challenges in terms of like approaching world building, reader expectations, tropes. So it does kind of feel like relatively familiar territory. But now I get to create my first like magic system, and what's the history of that magic, and why isn't it commonplace? Like why do humans not know about it? And I think that's really cool. Like it's a fun extra element of just sort of, I guess anything is possible, but also there is some constraints of like how would a society actually work, so yeah.
And our final question for you today is looking ahead a little bit. Now that you've got one self-published book under your belt and plans to self-publish a sequel, how do you feel about your choice to go with self-publishing as a way to get your work out there? And I guess the second part to that is, has traditional publishing ever interested you?
Yeah, love it. So yeah, in terms of future plans, working on this fantasy novel, which is like a YA fantasy sort of like girl detective. So that's kind of fun. I'm enjoying the mystery element. So yeah, and then I've the 716 is a trilogy, so I'm also working on the second book now. And yeah, that's quite fun. It's very thinky because again, the whole society is very different, but I think I'm excited to get that done hopefully soon. Oh yeah, the other part was the self-publishing bit. Yeah, no, I mean I adore self-publishing. I don't think I would have the 716 series any other way. It's kind of like, I would say it's my book baby. Like I'm really passionate about it, and I think self-publishing brings a lot of creative control. And like I knew what I wanted the cover to kind of look like and what the story that I wanted to tell, and I guess I wanted to make sure I had the final say in how Andy and Olivia's journey goes. And I guess there's also something quite magical about holding a book in your hands, knowing that you were responsible for all of those decisions, like not just the story, but like the formatting. And even if you didn't do it yourself, you made those decisions of how that's all going to come together. And so that's quite a magical sort of awesome feeling. So yeah, so I think I'm definitely for the 716 going to stick with that. I really enjoy that. I think I'd love to do traditional publishing sometime. Like I think that's quite an interesting, I mean, I'm always up for new experiences, and I think there's benefits to that as well, in terms of like you've got a support team, and there's you probably get a lot more reach and those sorts of things. I haven't done it, but I guess I also I like the snappiness of self-publishing, so that sort of long timeline of I think I'd almost have to be working on something like the 716 series too, so that I like could deal with the waiting. That's
So true. And the thing about even trad publishing is like we've had maybe two trad published authors on this show, and they were like, you're totally left to your own devices with marketing unless you're like a huge name. And so if I was like, well, if I'm going to have to do all my own marketing, I may as well just do the whole thing myself. And then no one can tell me what to do because I hate being told what to do. So that's just revealing myself here. So that's a bit like my approach to it. But then again, I wouldn't mind being traditionally published at some point. But I think there maybe certain stories are meant to be self-published so that you can tell them exactly the way you want to tell them and they come out exactly the way you want. So yes, thank you so much. It was so nice to meet you as close as we can be when you're in New Zealand and we're in Canada. But better than never meeting at all. That's the tea on the sci-fi genre. Don't forget to rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts and to follow us on social medias. We're at the Tea Grannies Podcast on Instagram and Threads, the new thing. And we are at the Tea Grannies on Twitter. So thank you for listening and happy writing.